guys so much for coming to our Looking Forward, Planning for the School Year Ahead webinar. I'm really glad that we can all come together in this really crazy time and bring together all of our school leaders and advocates and students. Just want to remind everybody that we're starting our membership drive for the 2021 school year. So if you want us to keep having events like this, please join us. I'll send out a link afterwards. So we originally wanted to have this event all about planning forward through the school year ahead. And in light of all of the protests across the states over the past 2 weeks, we wanted to dedicate the beginning talking really about diversity, equity, inclusion in the classroom and how we can integrate that into our schools moving forward. So we're going to start by talking about equity a little bit. Then we're going to actually hear from some students about economic justice and how they're fighting for it.
I've heard horror stories of people on planes that are like,
it's really important right now. And then we're going to transition into looking ahead into more of the logistical stuff for transitioning. We'll have some space for schools to share in the beginning of it. And then we'll also at the end hopefully have some time for Q&A and keep the room open past 3:30 so we can have extended Q&A for anyone who can stay. Just a reminder for everybody to mute themselves when they're not presenting. And I'm going to try not to cut people off when talking, so just try your best for presenters to watch the clock. So we're going to just turn to our board chair at CPICS, Ricardo, to hear a few words.
Hey everybody, good morning or good afternoon. And I just want to remind everybody, especially some new folks to CPICS, we're coast to coast here, right? So we have folks from all over the country that have logged in. Thank you. And this is more evidence. You saw that video of stuff that CPICS has done over the last couple of years. CPICS is ready to continue supporting all the independent schools in despite 2 pandemics, right? Despite new coronavirus and the old Jim Crow. So CPICS is there to help you guys. Today, I want to thank Violet and Edward for putting this together and see them as a resource. They're the staff that you didn't even know you have, or maybe you do know because they're so good. But like she said, we're going to hear from some great school leaders and students and alum. And we're going to be pushing throughout this session the virtual symposium. You saw the banner there in November. All right, so let's get ready for that. But everyone will be able to share what worked for them when we get back together in November. And we're going to celebrate that other thing that happens early in November, but no need to get into that. So Violet, let's go.
Thanks, Ricardo. So we're going to start by hearing from Chris Ferris from Highline Academy in Colorado. Chris is going to be speaking about leading with equity as a white leader. So Chris, go for it.
Thanks, Violet. I appreciate. I want to just preface, I'm going to share some slides with you, and I want to just preface it by saying that, you know, I think that there are people working in many different contexts and a lot of leaders of color on this call. And so some of what I'm sharing might feel like things that you know already or things that aren't as useful. But in the context that I'm in Denver, where I'm working frankly with a lot of white educators and a lot of white board members and things like that, it's been necessary to really define and explain the rationale for really diving into equity and inclusion work for the sake of our students who are very diverse. And so that's partly where some of this work has come from, and how to sort of move white people along on the trajectory. And so hopefully, even if this might be useful to you in some ways, even if you're already a person with this kind of mission in mind. So let me just find my presentation. So I call this responsibility, accountability, and humility, because I do feel like it is up to white people in our country to take responsibility for racism and to try to lead for change. And that, you know, that for too long a time we've sort of seen it as or some people have seen it as something that like people of color should be trying to lead for. And I actually think that that's not true, and that actually as a white person you do have to speak up for and lead for change in this area. But I also include humility in that title because I also feel like in order to do a good job doing that, we have to be accountable to, and we have to be good listeners to the people of color within our community, whether that's parents, students, community members, or even if we have to reach out to people in other communities to ask, because being a white person in this culture, you don't always see and understand the kind of racism that's happening, and it can be easy to make assumptions. So you have to continue to approach this work with humility and with the willingness to hold yourself accountable, and listening to the people who have the lived experience. So I'm the executive director of Highline Academy. We're a small 2-charter network in the Denver area. I prioritize this work because of our students. We have, 70% of our students are kids of color in the Denver community, and 60% of them are free and reduced lunch students. We have 25% are English language learners. So it is really important to me that I am, and yet 75% of our teachers are white women. Many of them are women who were raised in Denver. Some have moved here from Kansas and Wyoming and places like that. And so they don't always have the understanding and the context and the history of racism and how it's impacted kids and the kind of causes of oppression. And so I never want a teacher in one of the schools that I lead to go into the context of working with those kids and families, making assumptions and having an unconscious bias without any opportunity to learn how to change. And so that's kind of why I am doing this work now, and why I have been doing this work since I started at Highline. And I think some of these questions make less sense now than when I first put this presentation together, because I feel like we're having this real like raising of consciousness in this country about racism right now. But it was a question that I was asked a lot when I first started working at Highline, of like, why are you doing this? And why would you be pushing for this? And are you saying that we're not doing this well? And my answer to that is always like, you can always do it better, right? Like there's no really end of we're perfect and we're no longer in any way doing anything that replicates oppression and racism, because we live in this country and we are surrounded by the culture that we're in, and we are all sort of what I say is like breathing the smog of racism. So we're all impacted by it, and we have to constantly work at making sure that we are aware and surfacing things and like moving forward. So I just have some definitions here. For diversity, I think of that as having different types of people in your group, and that can be many different ways of thinking. It can be ways of thinking, it can be race, it can be past experiences, gender, physical abilities. Diversity means many, many things. This is I'm sure many of you have seen this graphic about equity, which is when we talk about equity, we're not talking about giving everybody the same thing, which is what you see under the little sign there for equality. We're talking about giving everybody what they need so they can all access the goal. So these kiddos all want to see the baseball game, but some of them have different starting points, and so we're giving them what they need in order to be able to reach their goal. And that's what we think of as equity in our organization. So ensuring equally high outcomes for all, removing the predictability of success or failure that currently comes with any social or cultural factor, examining our bias, and creating inclusive environments. So this is some research that the Bellwether consulting group out of Chicago did in Denver, and I found it's been very useful for helping to explain the reasons and the benefits for doing work on equity and inclusion in your school. So they did some research where they ranked schools as being strong in diversity, meaning that they had a lot of people from many different backgrounds in their organization, or low in diversity, and then high and low in inclusion. So by inclusion, they were asking staff members questions about, like, do you feel like your voice is heard? Do you feel like you have opportunities to help shape decisions? Do you feel like you have opportunities to earn promotions within your organization? A lot of different things like that. And then using those, they defined whether a school was what they call early stage, which meant it was both low in diversity, low in inclusion. Highly diverse, but still low in inclusion was another phase. And then kindred, which was low in diversity, but high in inclusion. And then advanced, which was high in diversity and high in inclusion. So once they did that, they then looked at how those schools were doing academically, and also with things like staff retention. And they found some really, really interesting information, which is that inclusion is a leading indicator for increasing equity in the organization. So even for schools that were not particularly diverse, if they were strong in inclusion, they tended to start to see better results for their students in equity. And then they also started to grow in diversity. So setting up your policies and your systems in a way that you are very inclusive of many voices in your organization can help change your organization in a multitude of ways.
So next we're going to hear from somebody else, also from Colorado. We're going to hear from Trina Mall, who's going to talk about inclusive HR practices. Trina, go for it.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am going to come from a different perspective. I am the Director of HR and Talent at the Colorado League of Charter Schools. So I'm going to talk about what we've been promoting a little bit in light of everything that's happened in the world. And so I'm coming to you as a friend, a supporter, and as not to insult anyone's knowledge or intelligence, but I'm coming in protest. So before I start up my screen, I want to tell you I'm in HR protest. And so for those that know what protest means, it means to object. So I am going to introduce some concepts to help you see why I'm objecting, some of the challenging I'm objecting, and I'm also questioning some of the HR practices we've had in the past to introduce you to some new processes in the future. So let me present inclusive HR in honor of my HR protest and my way of protesting and influencing in a different way in a different system. So love to hear feedback from you at the end, or email me if you have any more questions. And I now will share the screen. Righty. So again, this is in my HR protest in regards to inclusive human resources. So I will just leave this quote up just for a brief second. Don't want to read it to you because I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence of reading it. But this is where we are building the foundation from an HR system and structure from inclusivity. So where does inclusive HR begin? The journey begins in our beginning of three elements. One is in diversity, equity, inclusion. And so I'm going to walk us through where this foundational three components that we look at HR systems. So we couldn't start this without looking at what we call the 4 pillars of framework for human resources. And so I apologize, HR is human resources. So people, policies, processes, and systems. So constantly looking at each. As you can see, the systems are at the bottom. And if we're honest, it's at the bottom because we really need to dismantle some of the systems to get back to the people, policy, and processes. People, if you've heard me speak before, always will be first when we think about any way we're looking at a human resource system. So looking at, in addition, looking at the inclusive HR system, here are some of the core components and elements of a human resource management system. These are everyday functions that probably know and didn't think about, but you know, this is the world that I live in every day. But we start in HR, and they can move up and down. These boxes are not just stable, but they can be stagnant. Movable. And so we started diversity, equity, inclusion, and we have payroll, hiring and selection, training development, benefits, and compensation. So I'll use one of these in a few minutes as an example of how we can have inclusive HR systems. Next, we'll talk about just reiterating, in every employee that you will ever have, we call it the employee life cycle. I'm not sure if you've ever been exposed to the employee life cycle, but the moment an employee, what we call the attraction engagement, walks in the door, how do I look at the diversity, equity, inclusivity of the HR system? And then we move to the recruitment, the onboarding, development, retention, and separation, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. But a lot of the framework and core work that I do is always around the employee life cycle. So what are we doing in that life cycle to ensure that employees, we're meeting those needs? In addition, I will introduce, and you've seen this many times, but I always challenge the schools that I work at with to look at the 26 dimensions of diversity always. What does that look like when you're talking about inclusive HR systems? And again, I will give you an example in just a few minutes. I too have the slide of equity, but I will also share with you from an HR perspective, it also is equity and equality. And sometimes what does that look like? So one of the examples that I will share in one of the core elements of hiring, recruiting, hiring, and selection, you know, are you recruiting from a diverse candidate pool? Are you ensuring you have a diverse candidate candidate pool? And in addition, where is the leveling of the playing field? So looking at how do you look at different systems? Many of us look at the HR and the HR system. We always look at it from a hiring, but there are other practices. So I'll give you an example in the world of benefits and inclusion. So when we look at inclusion, here are words that employees have shared with us that they feel safe, valued, belonging, respected, and appreciated. So I had a school that called me last week and they were talking about revising their benefits. So we talked about, for instance, when you look at a benefit plan, you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, looking at who's in your organization, and do those benefits really match? Are they inclusive of what your employees need and how they should look? So for instance, in this school, it was a new school, and they actually had, they were looking at the majority of their demographics were teachers that were millennials and Zs. And so looking at much more inclusive benefits that related to those particular employees versus any benefits that did not. Okay, next is the why. What are some of the results? And so I wouldn't be at all giving you any inclusive HR if I can't share with the results. So of course, there's increased job satisfaction, engagement, retention, well-being. And I always say in the basics of HR, if we can't do it right, we have to at least do Maslow's basics right. And then I have some stats in the presentation that Violet will send. We'll have that in there. And then I will leave you with an inclusive HR, the time is now. And I know I went through it fast, but my contact information is in there. We don't have a lot of time, so I wanted to make sure that I was being respectful for each one of your, the time that's out there.
Thank you so much, Trina. That was great. And we'll send your contact info out to everybody.
Thank you.
All right, so now we are going to hear from Dr. Paul Miller, who is going to be speaking a little bit about systemic racism and how we can address that in our schools. Paul, go for it.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Paul Miller. I'm the CEO and principal at Green Tech High Charter School in Albany, New York. We are an all-boys school composed of about 97% Black males and over 87% poverty, yet we average a 95% graduation rate and 100% acceptance to college every year since inception. So we do a lot and we work hard, but as leaders, we have a lot of responsibility to make sure that we're handling our minority, our Black and brown kids with dignity and with grace, and making sure that we stand up and take a stance. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. All right, so what are our responsibilities as a leader? So we're going to talk about responsibilities as a leader. What are we fighting for? We're going to reflect on a few images. Privilege versus privileged. Where do we go from here? And what are your responsibilities to be a part of the solution? And what can action look like? So what are we fighting for? We're fighting for injustice. I believe it was said it is a virus that stems back to way before Jim Crow. It stems back to almost 1619. This fast forwards to slavery and the selling of Black individuals. And it just is something that America often doesn't recognize as is still a problem. So as leaders, it's our responsibility and obligation to recognize, understand, and empathize that there is still a problem, because our youth that we educate often resemble the Black and brown kids that are fighting for the injustices. So I wanted to show a quick video. Hopefully everyone can see it and hear it.
In a poor neighborhood, he has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded.
Sorry for the difficulty. I think it's having some loading issues.
His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So thank you all for watching that. I wanted to share some recent images now with the understanding that the systemic and the racism that is being faced, that it shouldn't just be faced because all of this is happening currently. This has been happening for years, and it's our obligation as leaders and leaders of educational institutions to step up and to do something about it and to have a voice. Silence is not okay. So as I am talking, there's two images on here. One depicting a young man who can't breathe. The other one is our president, right, wrong, or indifferent. This is his words and his perspective on the difference between white and black, you know, and I won't get into my political views, but I'm sure you guys know how I feel. Another image. Again, Goldilocks was calling the police and making the report after she broke into their house. But because they're black and brown and because they look scary, they're the ones being arrested. And they look scary based on whose standards? Different protest here. I believe everybody's familiar with George Floyd, which happened recently. They just had his funeral yesterday. And this is something that caused enough outrage to hopefully cause some change. But this has been happening for years upon years. And there's been differences where there's two white people who went into these places and they mass murdered people, and they were walked out kindly and offered beverages. And then there was a black man accused of cigarettes, selling cigarettes, and another one accused of possibly giving a phony $20 bill. This part of the systemic racism is being charged for the same crime and being around the same age, but because of different skin colors, they were given different sentences. One got 2 years, the other one got 26 years in prison. This was recently. They both were out after the curfew. The one gentleman got a $100 bond, the other one got $500 bond. So you think poverty is an individual failure? It's not. It's a system that's engineered against black and brown people, and it's so racially ingrained. But the opportunity is that as educators, all of the kids have to come through our hands. We get to see them, and we get to work on helping to change the mindsets of them. So if you ask about it, there's slavery, there's Jim Crow, there's civil rights, where the civil rights era was a time when you couldn't sit at a counter. That we're doing all of this arguing, and we've just gotten rights to vote and could sit at the counter. The crack epidemic, for those of you not familiar, the government placed it in black and brown communities to destroy the black and brown communities, but also to fund the wars that were happening in South America. The 1994 crime bill that has enhanced the mass incarceration of black and brown minorities with the 3 strike laws. So what is privilege versus privileged? So privilege is earned. Privileged is given. So how is being privileged making it easier to earn privileges? And that's what I'd love for you to think about, is think about your own privilege and think about if you were born privileged, how is that making it easier for you? And what are your obligations now to step up and use your privilege to say and to do something, to fight back for the underprivileged? So white privilege is about the concrete benefits of access to resources and social rewards and the power to shape the norms and values of society that whites receive unconsciously and consciously by virtue of skin color and in a racist society. Now, I do trainings on white privilege and some other items, so I'm available for that. I'm just trying to go through to give this to be respectful of time, but we can definitely have a whole discussion and training about what this looks like and how it historically over the course of our country has been into play. So where do we go from here? And I'm going to try to round this up. So I believe as school leaders, you have to address all issues of racism personally and in your school. You cannot sweep it under the carpet, even if it's your best teacher, even if it's your wealthiest parent. It does not matter. You have to address it. It's your obligation. Do not tolerate racist behavior from staff or students. Take swift, strong action. Take a stance. Hold yourself and demand leaders, teachers, and all to be accountable for their policies and for their constituents. So see something, say something. Improve cross-cultural communications and build cultural relevance in your curriculums of schools. We owe it to teach Black history because it's not Black history, it's American history, and it should be taught in everything. It should be relevant to the times and what we're doing, and it should go across disciplines. Develop deeper connections, build empathy, remove sympathy, and the savior syndromes. The savior syndrome's got to go because sympathy kills and empathy heals. Invest in learning different cultures within your building. Let students speak their native language when possible and appropriate. And it should be often. Build that culture within your school. What are your responsibilities to be a part of the solution? Stand up, say something, do something, use your voice. Silence is an omission of guilt. I will personally say to you as all of leaders, and not to judge you, but if you have said nothing to the communities that you're in right now, if you have said nothing to your students, if you have said nothing to your families or taken a stance, then you are part of the problem. You need to stand up and show out and show that you are standing in justice. As leaders of Black and brown students, you have an obligation to show the Black and brown students that their lives matter. And last but not least, you know what? Here's some items that you can do to get involved. Organize a protest, support a protest, be one of us. How would you feel? Empathize, try to put yourself in the situations. What if that was your son on the ground with the knee in his neck for 9 minutes? Please try to empathize with that situation. Use your social media platforms. Conduct a press conference. Recently, we just conducted a press conference here to speak up to the community as leaders, to give our perspectives and our points, and try to reach out to help promote healing and not hurting. Write an op-ed, support Black businesses. Your school should support Black businesses and help your Black and brown students to become entrepreneurs. Build those programs into your school as well. We could talk about those specifics. So if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. I just encourage you to stand up. I encourage you to take my contact information so we can continue dialogues and conversation and any type of help or support that I can be. I know Violet will send out this presentation with my information in it as well. I really appreciate everybody for taking the time to listen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. That was really helpful, and it's great to see some positive reactions in the chat box, so thank you guys. We're now going to transition to hearing from some students. Joe Nathan's going to introduce them, and we are running a little bit behind schedule, but I want everyone to have the amount of time that they can, so we're going to give the students 10 minutes. And Joe, you want to introduce them?
You're now going to hear from two students who are chartered public school students in Minnesota. One led a successful campaign to get legislators to not introduce a moratorium on charters. And you're going to also hear from a young man who was featured in the largest newspaper in the state of Minnesota today for leading a campaign for economic justice at the legislature. So why don't we start with Walter? Walter's going to tell us 3 minutes about a campaign that he's leading. This is Walter Cortina, a charter school student, and you'll hear from him for the next 3 minutes.
Hi everybody. I hope everybody's doing well and staying safe during these tough times. It's an amazing time in history. A lot of action, a lot of stuff's going on. Like Joe said, I've been leading the campaign to make sure that students in Minnesota can apply for unemployment benefits. I'm currently in the country. We're the only state, sorry about that, that denies the benefits to high school students. And even in the federal CARES Act, it doesn't limited to age restrictions or to high school students. And so we've just been working to try to pass bills or a bill to add some language to the existing law to just expand that eligibility to allow the high school students to apply. And so over the past few weeks, we've been in touch with a lot of senators and representatives, and we've even spoken with the governor's team. And like Joe said, we did get a news coverage in the Star Tribune yesterday, and thank you for that. Yeah. I did just want to introduce myself a little bit. I'm 17. I'm still in high school for recording arts, and I'm also the executive director of Bridgemakers, a nonprofit that's committed to supporting and mentoring the voice and leadership of marginalized youth as they help break cycles of poverty and miseducation and violence.
Great. And if there's a minute, we can ask people to ask a question if they have it of Walter. Walter has been earning money to support his family since the age of 13.
Yeah, I've been financially independent. My mom got deported halfway through my 7th grade year, and then my dad got incarcerated when I was like 7, 8. And so my mom, she left me here with my older brother, and I decided to stay because of my education, because this is the land of opportunities, and and so we struggled, like two teenage kids like couldn't like manage themselves. We ended up losing the light, the heat, the water, just like all the like necessary like basics that you need. And I went homeless for a few months, just jumping house to house, just trying to stay with shelter over my head. Eventually, one of my aunties, she was able to let me move in with her, but she got breast cancer about like 3 to 4 months after I had moved in with her, so she wasn't able to work, and so I had to get a job, and while still going to high school, and about 2 to 3 months after my auntie got breast cancer, my mom got breast cancer, and she was in Mexico City and staying with my little brother, and so she wasn't able to work, and so I had to get a second job, sometimes working 3 jobs to be able to maintain myself, my mom, and my little brother and my auntie. And so all this, it really made me angry, and just upset because in the position I was in, I wasn't able to make change, and I wasn't able to stop the like challenges I was facing. At least at the time, I wasn't in a position of power. I didn't know the right connections, and I just didn't like know how to get help. But luckily, I did meet a great mentor who's on this call. I think John Bacall, and he has been mentoring and helped me change my life. And just to like all school leaders, I really want to mention that student voice is really, really important. Like to make sure that you hear from your students and that you hear like what their needs are. Students should always be at the table. A lot of times, students are not actually at the table, and most of these things are about us. So how is it about us without us?
Great. Thank you very much. Walter attends a charter high school for recording arts in St. Paul, which strongly promotes service learning. We're going to hear next from Lincoln Bacall, also a high school charter school student in Minnesota, who also attends a charter that strongly promotes service learning. And Lincoln, please describe the campaign that you helped organize, that led to a successful resolution. Thank you.
Hey guys, so I'm Lincoln. I'm a senior for another week in high school at Venture Academy, which is a project-based learning charter school, and I also run a youth empowerment and action organization called Twin Cities Changemakers, which we believe nothing about us without us, so decisions shouldn't be made that impact young people without young people being at the table helping to make those decisions. So that's why, first of all, we worked on this campaign to stop a charter moratorium in Minnesota, or a suggested one. The bill didn't even get introduced, I think, thanks to the work that we did. So we organized a rally at the town hall of the legislator who was going to introduce that bill. And we spoke at the town hall in front of his constituents. And I think that was very effective. A lot of students who attend charter schools spoke at that town hall because, this proposed charter moratorium, like most issues that impact youth, was going to be made by adults who don't even know what it's like to go to a charter school. They just hear the word charter school and they have their preconceived notions about why that's a bad thing, and about how, maybe I even heard that charter schools, I don't know, support segregation or something ridiculous like that. But in Minnesota, I think some of our charter schools are the best schools to go to for marginalized young people. And yeah, so that's about that campaign. I've also been working with Walter on our Support Working Youth campaign, which is to get unemployment benefits for high school students. But one thing that I'd like to use this platform to say, this opportunity, thank you for letting me come here and speak, is the reason that I work on Twin Cities Changemakers, our empowerment organization, the reason for all of this is because I believe that schools are another thing that Nothing About Us Without Us applies to. For centuries, schools have been designed for students by adults, which I think is ridiculous. And my vision for the future of America is that public education, starting with charter schools will start to be redesigned and reshaped by the students who go to them. And so schools can really reflect the needs of 21st century students. And I see that most in charter schools, that charter schools are being innovative and they're actually catering to the needs of their students, which is amazing. But I hope that in the future, this is something that all schools start to do. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to these young people, and thanks to the organizers of the meeting.
Thank you all, and thanks, Joe, for getting everyone together. That was really great, and I really appreciate all the positive comments to the young people in the chat. It was great to hear from you guys. So we're going to hear one more presentation on this equity topic, and then we're going to jump gears into more the logistics of planning ahead. So I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes to Nasha Khan from My Red Rabbit.
Thank you very much for including me on the platform. And before even introducing myself, I'd like to take a second and applaud I don't know how else to say it, except for overwhelming story of Walter, the initiative of Lincoln, and the initiatives of Dr. Paul Miller, Trina, and anybody else who's presented so far. It's nice to be in a community of like-minded individuals and in individuals and organizations who believe in institutional change. My name is Nasher, and I'm a director of a healthy school food provider based here in East Harlem, Manhattan, New York, called Red Rabbit. We've been doing so, or working on essentially revising, reforming school food for about the last 15 years, working primarily with what we consider Title I schools, children who are low income, predominantly Black or brown, and otherwise have a reality, a narrative crafted for them that is out of their hands, a narrative that feeds into a overarching predisposition to hypertension, obesity, diabetes, and other chronic related illnesses. So our thought process and our essentially initiative to provide food, healthy food and exposure for children in these communities started as a social call to action. And it has continued for the last 15 years as a social call to action. I know that there are educators and schools here from across the country. So you might find value in some of the stuff I say. You might see your own communities reflected in some of my stories or my words. Some might not. However, it's a reality that I'm articulating for what is around. Walter's story is powerful. However, it is a story that we have come across in one form or another hundreds of times here amongst our students. We work with quite a few charter schools throughout New York, throughout Brooklyn, Manhattan, all the boroughs. And we have seen that these children, when we talk about access to education, a necessary precondition for that access to education is food. Food, not as a matter of necessity, but food as a matter of justice also needs to be revised. As food is a central tenet that a child requires, not only just food, but good, healthy food is a central tenet that a child builds upon. Nothing happens. I originally come from Pakistan, and a product of varying degrees of hunger and exposure can attest to the fact that there is nothing that happens at all if your stomach is not full, and if it's not full with nutrient-dense food, not just calorie-dense. So reviewing food, again, within this broader ecosystem of justice, of righting the wrongs of the past and reversing the scales. Social justice cannot work without environmental justice, which is again predicated on food justice. Now, as we have moved from an era where you have seen entities like Red Rabbit and others, and partners, educators, partners like yourself, advocating for better food conditions, not only in school, but also in homes of these individuals. Moving into COVID, we have seen a big shock to the system. A shock where, unfortunately, primary response has been to cater to the lowest common denominator, which is essential, which is how do we ensure that the most amount of food for the most amount of people, however, not taking into account the health, the quality of that food. So when schools open up, and hopefully as they do open up in September, our children will have gone through 6-7 months of malnutrition, either being undernourished or being fed with a variation of bologna sandwiches and chocolate milk and chocolate chip cookies, 7-8 months. I don't have to tell you the toll that takes on the mental, emotional, physical health of a child. And then as we go into September, we are faced with the additional burden, at least here in New York, of budget cuts for the Department of Education. And those budget cuts reflect in the quality of education we provide to our children, and the quality of services we provide to our children. I want to implore you all not to view this as an opportunity to make outstanding or across the board cuts, but as an opportunity for reflection to see how and what do we prioritize. And as we come up with our list of priorities, access to education, educational attainment, and social progress through educational justice, please view food and healthy food as a necessary precondition for that educational attainment. This is an opportunity for us to reflect and to act, to allocate and reallocate, and truly work with our student body, not just for them, to better serve them. So unfortunately, I don't have a presentation and I don't have anything else other than a pretty earnest sort of call to action for the educators, not just in New York, but across the country, to reevaluate what school and what food means in that equation of educational access and educational attainment. If you need any more information for our organization, it can be found at www.myredrabbit.com. And if you feel strongly about this issue, I'm more than open to have a dialogue. And if not me, please, whoever your food provider is, whoever your community food advocate is, please engage them in this conversation and see what element of healthy school food, nutritional education, physical education can we bring into these children's lives so that we can truly, as Dr. Paul Miller said, start reforming the system, and food being as integral a part of that system as anything else. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll send your info out so everyone can ask some questions. I think that's super important right now as we're entering this complete unknown. So now we're going to shift gears and we're going to hear from Mark on reopening schools. Mark's going to give a few minutes for folks to share out. And then at 3, we're going to hear from another school. And then hopefully at the end, we will have some time for some Q&A and conversation for anyone who wants to stay. So go ahead for it, Mark. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Appreciate it. I'm going to try and be as concise as possible to make up some time, but do just want to start by thanking, number one, Violet and Edward for their leadership in uncertain times, all the presenters today, and then also to CPICS in general. I mean, like most people, I've been on a lot of webinars. This is the only place where student voice is often brought up directly from kids, and that's really empowering and encouraging, and I'm grateful for that. And with that, now an adult is going to talk for about 10 minutes. So take that with a grain of salt. So just to give a little bit of background, we support schools around school leadership. Obviously, we're working with schools based on their current reality. But what I'm going to talk about for the next couple of minutes is not necessarily what individual schools are doing or what we're doing in partnership with them, but more about how we're approaching conversations with our school partners and the questions we're asking and how we're trying to move their thinking along as we all face a new reality that is really uncertain and uncomfortable for a lot of folks. So full disclosure, when we first started talking about this, we were in COVID. And now we're talking about much broader levels of uncomfort around social injustice and folks' voice that have been marginalized and not at the table. But I think, again, this is more about how we're working with schools, not the individual problems we are trying to solve in partnership with them. But I did want to put out that caveat that this is a hard shift from some really big topics that are affecting our society to really micro level around school leadership and planning. And I just wanted to own that on the front end. So with that, when we are working with our partners, one of the things we're talking and asking a lot is just about how they respond and adapt to uncertainty and disruptions, being that that's the norm we're all living in. And so like most folks, there's some analogy people like. This is the one that I enjoy and I think really resonates. So if you're watching any sort of TV, we don't have TV, we have Hulu, we're bombarded with Carvana ads. Their tagline is now we were built for this, or we were made for this. I would argue that at best, that is a focus on a company and a current crisis. Not the customer, not what they intend to do. At worst, I'd say that is an example of a company taking advantage and seeing the current pandemic as a selling opportunity and a justification for their model that has been around, quite frankly, for years. On the flip side, traditional car dealerships, my thoughts are their response was slower. But where they are now, I would say they are adapting to customer need in a way that an organization or a company like Carvana is positioning itself in a very different. So whether that need is someone doesn't feel safe or comfortable going to a car lot, or whether that need is I want to go to a car lot, car dealerships have fundamentally changed their delivery method in the current reality. And I fundamentally believe that this new modality, the new way that they're serving, is going to be a part of their model moving forward. And I think this is an example of when we are talking with brick and mortar schools about how they're facing the new reality. This is sort of the theme we're trying to drive home in partnership with them, that it is time to broaden our horizons around what teaching and learning can look like and how it can get done, and not see these things as mutually exclusive or as a result of a given incident or a given moment in time. But all of this, I think, can be summed up with what we've been saying a lot with partners, is that we're in a permanent state of whitewater. So what we mean by that is there's constant disruption, there's uncertainty, there's things that are changing beyond one person's control. I personally think that these uncertainties and disruptions are going to increase in frequency and complexity. But school leaders and school leadership teams can embrace that and can pivot the way they tackle these challenges, and how they use that as an opportunity to best serve their school and their school communities. So for us, we norm around two terms. One is fixed leadership. So this is very similar for those that are familiar with mindset and Dweck's work around fixed and growth. So a fixed leader, we would say, is often isolated. They think they should go it alone, and they view these disruptions as actually temporary and that things are going to settle down. They're going to go back to normal. Folks that we are pushing to be more agile and build that muscle, we would say we are pushing them and we're encouraging them and we're thought partnering with them around creating teams, both internal and external. I think this is a time where we all need to be looking beyond our four walls for solutions and ideas. We are pushing them, obviously, to adapt based on the needs of others and to things beyond their control. And most importantly, in the through line here, is to see setbacks or challenges or disruptions as opportunities, not as barriers, right? So to bring this into our current reality around COVID and around distance learning and reopening, I think, like most organizations, we're outlining, there's essentially three scenarios that all schools are going to be facing, right? Scenario one, we go back to normal. And all of this was a blip on the radar, and schools operate like they would a year ago. Personally, I think that's highly unlikely. Scenario 2, they reopen. There's various measures in place to ensure social distancing, and to ensure safety of students, families, and educators. Option 3, or scenario 3, schools don't reopen. Our work with schools right now, and where we're really pushing them in their forward thinking in being agile, and being able to anticipate their community need, is that the through line here is that distance learning should be seen as a way and as an opportunity to better serve their school community in all of these scenarios. So one of the things that we keep talking about with school leaders is, in scenario 1, if school goes back to normal, I would still encourage those schools to use distance learning as a way to address absenteeism, which I think is going to be very high, as a way to address homebound students, as a way to address suspended or expelled students. Obviously, in scenario 2, distance learning is going to be a formalized part of the educational model. And then in scenario 3, it is going to be the educational model. But I think the big point we're trying to nail home with our partners is that what occurred from March to May is the starting point. It isn't where schools should be ending as they think about their ability to meet the needs of students, families, and educators. And one example of that is their distance learning plan and what they can do to improve it in the summertime and ongoing, to have it be a meaningful part of their school and their school community, not just a response to a crisis. So with that, one of the things that we're working with some of our partners on is essentially, how do you improve your distance learning? So again, this is one example. This type of systems or process thinking can be used in any aspects of a school community. And obviously everyone can read the slide. I don't need to read it to you, but what I want to draw attention to is that anytime a school leader is reflecting upon or analyzing a program, a system at their school, they need to be, in my opinion, they need to be pretty open and honest about the current reality and use various data sources. So that is one area where we've been able to work with some school leaders in pushing their own thinking. So for example, when I use the term blind spots around distance learning, there's some schools that they didn't teach certain subjects. There's some schools that they didn't teach SEL. They weren't doing anything around culture. There's some schools that they weren't providing captioning for their videos that students were accessing both synchronously and asynchronously, which is actually a violation of certain public school laws in certain states. So big picture, I would encourage school leaders to look at various data sources, both outcomes-based. If there aren't outcomes-based data, I would venture a guess that your distance learning wasn't as robust as it could be. And I'd really encourage school leaders to hear the voice of those that these systems are meant to serve. So whether it be through surveys, whether it be through focus groups, if you're not hearing from people directly, like students, families, and educators, I think it's going to be very hard to identify areas of improvement and make this a true and meaningful aspect of your school community on a go-forward basis. And the last part is around user experience. I don't know, and I can't speak for anyone on this call, but if you haven't logged in as a student in your school and participated in classes, I think it's going to be very hard for you to be able to identify areas of growth or opportunity as you look to re-envision your distance learning plan, and as you look to bolster it and make it stronger, knowing that it's going to have to be a part of any reopening scenario that your school faces. And it could also be used in the best of times and the calmest of times as a way, again, to address those things like chronic absenteeism, suspensions, homebound, and things like that. So again, that's just one example. I understand it's very dense. I know Violet's going to be sending this out. I'm happy to continue the conversation with anyone. But big picture, this distance learning evaluation, this formal process, is what we're working with schools to then use as their reopening plan. And so we are helping schools think through what the multiple ways your schools can look like, rethink teaching and learning with distance learning and other modalities and other aspects that have been covered over the past few months and well before that, and how to bolster it, how to design it in a different way so that students, families, and educators can thrive in calm as well as in crisis. And then big picture, there's a lot of, in my opinion, revamping that's going to need to be done to meet the current need for issues that are within our control as school leaders or some that aren't. So the more planning that schools can do now with an eye towards multiple scenarios and multiple modalities, and re-envisioning ways or reimagining ways to address students, families, and educator need, whether it's around planning, whether it's around DEI, which we've been talking a lot about today, school culture, PD, those school communities are going to be much better served. But now is really the time, I think, to be reflective and open and honest about what was and wasn't accomplished, be open to outside fact, and be really true to the data that you have and how you're hearing all stakeholder voice in an effort to make those adjustments, that reimagining and that revamping much stronger for your school community as we look towards next year. So with that, in an effort to make up some time, I'm gonna, Violet, I don't know if you're opening it up, or I think there's some other folks that want to share.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's great. I'll be sending that out to everybody. I think we're just going to move into the next presentation, and then we'll have some time at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to Ricardo again, who's going to introduce some folks from his school.
Folks, so we want to talk about an alliance called Proyecto Ya, Project Now, right? And this is an alliance that was started in Los Angeles to build trust now with our teachers and parents. And the idea is to focus on the actual implementation details that are not available in all of the multiple official guidance documents that we're getting. Exactly which chemical are we supposed to use, and how do we spread it, and what's the temperature we're checking for, those kinds of details. And so it comes from the statement that, you know, we are experts of our own truth and reality, right? So we got to figure out a lot of stuff out for ourselves. And I want to just, a point that was made from the previous speaker, we're going to see a lot of absenteeism and staying at home. So it's really about enrollment, which is the trust. What kind of trust are we building with our parents? So I have two of the folks that have worked with us on this, and I'm just going to ask them some questions and let them answer. And so let me cue up Yvette King-Berg. Yvette, if you can just tell us a little bit about your school and how Proyecto Ya, the Alliance, has helped you or is helping you right now.
Nice to meet everyone. Wonderful to be a part of your call today. Actually, I'm the executive director of 3 independent charter schools. We serve approximately $1,000, but in 1,000 students between 5th and 12th grade. However, in Los Angeles, that's like tiny. Most of the schools that we have around us are some of the larger CMOs that have thousands, 4,000 to 5,000 of students within their systems. And so when I first started thinking about, my head is in 2 different places. Sorry, Ricardo. Social justice and students, it's called, we have to figure out a way to get open, stay open. And when we first shut down, the first part was our kids can't afford for them to not have access directly to our teachers. So now we're looking at the question of how do we reopen, and how do we leverage the idea and notion that some of these pieces that we're going to have to purchase to even begin to come up with a plan, is we're going to need to be able to do that in terms of looking at joining forces with others. So I picked up the phone and called Ricardo and said, hey, brother, I'm working on reopening. I'm sure you are. So what if we kind of think about planning together? And I'm looking at economies of scale. How can, whatever you're planning to buy, whatever I'm planning to buy, let's share resources and perhaps bring other people in, so that when we go to place an order, because we're right next to one of the largest school districts in Southern California, LA Unified, as soon as we go to place an order, we know that we're going to be bumped out by that big order, whatever it is, and whatever time that they were going to actually get their orders in. So that's how we started Proyecto Ya. It was a matter of looking at how do we collaborate amongst schools. Ricardo invited a couple of more school leaders in, and so did I, and we were able to reach out also to another dear friend of ours, May. But ultimately, it's about, we couldn't wait for other people to come up with a plan for us. We needed to come up with a plan. We basically have the guidance from health department officials and the State Department officials, and we couldn't really wait for the local school district serving more than 600,000 students to tell us what we needed to do for our kids and for our community. And quite frankly, I have to really just be honest with you, just hearing some of the concerns of our families, because we have done those surveys. Thank you, Mark. It was great to hear that just affirmed that doing surveys of families and students and stakeholder teachers in terms of reopening, how do they feel, and building that trust. So we basically started off on this path. We basically divided some of the work between some of the groups of schools. And, we've created a survey to actually provide for our families. And right now, it's kind of nice to know that right now in this moment where I sit, 85% of my families want to come back. And yet the big district next to me is talking about, well, parents are not going to bring their kids back. Parents don't want to come back. And I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. Have you checked in to see what they really want to do? And have you really checked in to see what your staff wants to do? And is that the same or is it different? And then what do we do to bridge the gap?
So Yvette, I'm gonna jump in here on that point. I had some conversations with our parents last night, and they were very thankful. Like, oh wow, you're talking to us. The other schools aren't talking to us. So it's about talking now, proyecto now, and you're not going to be able to build this trust later on. We've been able to expand this, and one of the other persons I invited to jump in with us here is Meg Palisock. Meg, can you talk a little bit about how you've been able to get some more schools involved?
Yeah, hi. I'm one of the founders of Synergy Academies. We have 3 schools in South Los Angeles, and I left 3 years ago to do consulting with schools. So I see my successor, Rhonda Diamampo, is part of the group. So glad to see that Synergy is still involved. And super excited that you guys created this because, as you know, being small schools, especially startup and or founders, like it's a lot of work to figure out all this stuff on your own. And that's just starting a school under the old way of how things operate. And then all of a sudden with COVID and everything, right? It's like, whoa, how do I figure all this stuff out now on my own? And so love the energy of this group nationally to just support each other. And so because I consult with schools, different leaders of different small charter schools who have anywhere from like 1 to 4 schools that they run have reached out to me separately. Like, what do we do? How do we figure out how many masks do we need? What kind of masks do we need? How do we clean our schools? What hand sanitizer should we get? So when Yvette and Ricardo put this group together, I got the different schools I was working with, instead of like talking to everybody individually, let's all work together because other folks have already done research on different pieces. And so the thought was, more minds together, the better, not just for ideas and support, but also potentially leveraging bulk discounts. If we can all get, bigger numbers of quantity and buy things together, then maybe we can get a better discount. And then since then, a group very similar that got together in San Diego also reached out to me and said, hey, if you're working with this group in LA, can we share ideas and resources as well between LA and San Diego? So it's like the word is spreading. I also created a blog because of all the people reaching out to me. So I'm going to put in the chat box my blog for school leaders from the past couple months that also helps folks figure out all these different pieces that we're talking about as well. And I'll continue to add to it. And based on the resources our group comes up with, happy to help share with folks what people in LA and San Diego are thinking about on how to move forward with reopening your schools.
So thanks, Meg. And really, it's just the power of the telephone, right? Call your neighbors and reach out and see what they're doing. I'll really quickly just talk about 2 examples. We're getting air purifiers for every single room. That's kind of like a HEPA filter for every room. We got a bulk discount on that. A lot of schools jumped in on that one. And then another one is we learned about a cleaning strategy with electrostatic sprayers and a product called Pure Tabs. We were looking at different options, but that's the one that really locked in. And then as a result of that, we found out that that's also what L Unified was using. So it became very simple. When they're going to criticize us as not being clean and safe, we can say, but we're doing the same thing you're doing, right? So it's really about building trust, having the details so you can build that trust, getting everyone involved or more people involved to help you with that, and being out in front. Avance is going to open on August 10th. We're going to start with testing everybody. We came up with a strategy to make sure that we can test all the students. And so, we thank you guys for this time to describe a strategy that worked for us.
Thanks, Ricardo. That's great. That was really good, you guys. It was good to use some examples. And we'll send your info around. So we have 3 more presentations. I know we're running a little short on time, but we can stay open after for Q&A. So we're going to hear from Sebastian for 5 minutes, talking about reducing the distance and distance learning, which I think we'll get at some of the questions in the chat. Sebastian, take it away.
Thank you, Violet. Yeah. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to participate here. It's a privilege. I have a lot more thanks to share, but I'll keep it concise. I really appreciate hearing from everyone so far. So when the opportunity to participate today came up, it was a while back ago, and although we were in distance learning and living this pandemic, the world was still different, or the United States was different. So my topic was a little lighter, and I think will lighten things up, which could be refreshing and just as well. I really appreciate hearing the logistics and obviously the times we're living in. But as I share my screen, I think you'll see that the content is lighter, but resonated strongly with our students, which I found from our families was very much appreciated. So yeah, I titled the session, just kind of reducing that distance and distance learning. One thing that became very clear for us when whoa, what happened to my screen share? Oh, I'm gonna try, Violet, to share my screen, but it's kind of wigging out on me. So I'll talk about it and then I'll share it with you. See if that can happen. I have a bunch of errors as I try to share. So I will
share it too.
Yeah. So I'll share with you a little bit about what we did. I'll give you the highlights and I'm able to share. You'll definitely get the info. So March 13th, we made the decision, as many schools across California did. I should share, we're in Southern California, about 35 miles east of Los Angeles. We're what's called transitional kinder. That's like a pre-K here in California through 8th grade independent charter school. On March 13th, when we made the decision to close, on March 16th, we were able to start distance learning. So there was really no time off, which I know, unfortunately, for a lot of schools, including some charters, that wasn't a possibility due to lack of resources or whatever it may be. So we were fortunate, even though we're 100% seat-based, classroom-based charter school, on the first day of our closure, we were able to get experiences going from kids. And one thing that occurred to me that was very clear from the first moment was that the priority at this time for our kids needed to be connections and familiarity, connection to their school community, and trying to offer some semblance of normalcy in this new model where they would be learning from home. And so we immediately put into practice some features that we didn't have in place before, because we took for granted the fact that we were showing up here every day, and now we wouldn't be showing up for an indeterminate amount of time. So we immediately started a YouTube channel, which many schools have already had, but we did not. And we did, and daily staff that our kids were not seeing, our office staff, our food service staff, our custodians, myself as a CEO and principal, we were creating short challenges every day that would go out through the YouTube channel and all kids and parents would receive. And they were short activities you can do from home. Get chalk and go on the sidewalk and make an obstacle course, make a fort in your bedroom, and all these little small things that didn't require you to run out to the store to buy things, but helped you stay connected to the school. And it really resonated with our families. They became the hit of distance learning, was the ASA TV Daily Challenge. We continue to hold assemblies virtually, and our student leadership team would take those over, and they were theme-based and also incorporated a challenge or a call to action. So we had, for example, a heroes-themed assembly in which myself and the leadership team, students dressed as heroes, but then it ended by honoring the heroes, our essential workers, our grocery store workers, our truck drivers, and then there was a call to action to celebrate those community members. So that created some unity and connections for our kids and so on. We also continue to host, I would host a morning, coffee with the community chat, and we continue to host those virtually, which was interesting enough. Our parents asked for them to move from once a month to once a week. So you can see, as you know, our parents wanted some connection to the schools as well. So we did these small things that, in addition to teachers teaching live lessons daily, several times a day, we saw this strong call to other opportunities to stay connected to the school. And we were real intentional of making sure that it involved others other than our teachers, who were not necessarily who were not necessarily being seen by the kids because they weren't in the teacher role, right? Our teachers were connecting with kids daily, but your office staff, your custodials, and so on. So we called them in to help produce these. And at, while other schools in the area, and I had some data to share, we're talking about 30 to 40% participation during distance learning. We were over 90%, and we serve the same demographic, in Chino as our surrounding schools. So we don't have a different demographic. We have an identical one to the community, yet we had a stronger participation rate. And I know as a school of choice versus a non-school of choice, there's always that factor, right? In families that choose us over those who don't. But there's something to be said about 3 times the rate of participation and attendance with a similar demographic, and so on. So those small little actions, aside from the academic and the social emotional pieces that the teachers are responsible for, really have resonated with our community. They're the pieces that parents have told me have resulted in their kids remaining connected to their school. They were light, they were fun, they were never too overwhelming for anybody. Maybe for our leadership kids to put together virtual assemblies was a little tough, but they pulled it off. They pulled off a Beatles themed assembly. They pulled off the Heroes assembly, and they had a couple others that were theme based as well. So one thing we also dealt with the tech glitches, like me sharing my screen right now, but I'll make sure you get, I linked everything in my slides, which I wanted to get to you guys as well. A lot we were proud of in regards to what we were able to do overnight in distance learning. A lot of our families do share that academically, they're not necessarily concerned with their kids' progress. The fact that we were able to, to provide a distance learning program every day of our original school year. We didn't end early. We didn't take, weeks to prepare. Aside from that, I thought a real kind of highlight for us was this connections piece that we were able to come up with. And so I wanted to be able to share that, with you. So I'll make sure that Violet gets the slides so everyone else gets them as well. I think I should be able to link it on the chat. So thanks for the opportunity to do that, especially without my slides right now. I just had to look at the space. So thanks, Violet.
Thank you, Sebastian, for joining us. Speaking of tech glitches, Violet's having a little tech glitch right now. So we're going to go on to our next speaker, Megan Olson, who is going to discuss how to prioritize special education. So go for it, Meg.
Thank you. In 5 minutes, right? I'll give you all the answers. I'm going to share my screen. My name is Megan Olson. I'm the Managing Director of Programs at the National Center for Special Education in Charter Schools. And I apologize for joining 10, 20 minutes ago. We were in the middle of strategic planning. It's sort of hard to come in and not be able to create through lines with the things that you all have been talking about, but looking at the agenda, I don't feel like this will be very far off. So prioritizing special education during forward planning. Let me just briefly tell you about our organization, and obviously you'll get these slides. Our mission is to make sure that students with disabilities are able to access and thrive in charter schools. We do that by documenting and communicating facts, informing policy where we can, developing coalitions, so bringing together stakeholders at all levels, at the school level, at the sort of larger ed organizational level, policy level, to try to incorporate the facts into making systemic change. And then we also try to build expertise in the field. So we do a lot of work out in districts and states across the country to look at practices related to special education and point to areas where they can be improved to ensure equity for students with disabilities. This quote, "In times of crisis, the most important things reveal themselves," has continuously floated across my radar for the last however many months we've been doing this, both in my personal but also in the professional world. And I bring this up to just take 2 minutes. You're not sharing 2 minutes, actually we don't have. Take a few seconds. No one is sharing this out loud, but if you can just think about what your plan has been for educating students with disabilities, as you're thinking about, maybe you've already made the decision to go one route, or you're planning multiple scenarios. What has been your game plan thus far for students with disabilities? And then think about why that is the case. And I bring that up to say, in the conversations we've had with schools across the country, we hear everything from, we don't know what to do, so we're just going to have them essentially come in on, all of our students with disabilities will come in on one day, and all of our general education students will come in on another day. And we want to be careful that in a moment where we feel like we aren't putting resources in the form of staff time and planning around students with disabilities, we aren't creating more segregated models. And I'll talk about opportunities that exist from all the learnings from this COVID-19 school closure. So to just like self-assess what has been our planning thus far, super important is that IDEA exists even in the time of a crisis. So nothing related to the IEP is waived at this moment. And it shouldn't be. And even if districts decide that certain components could be, which we haven't gone down that road, we would hope that we would use our flexibility and autonomy to continue to put this forward as part of our larger equity initiative. Things that schools can do to design to the edges are leverage collaborative multidisciplinary teams. So when you're making these large decisions, do you have special educators at the table, whether it's a special education leader or even a teacher who understands the implications of, I have a specific student with a specific need that I am teaching, and these 3 decisions that you've just put on the table absolutely don't fit for this one student. And so if we actually center students and their experiences in the decision making from the beginning, if we're planning for more complex situations, inherently we can better meet the needs of everyone. So a huge part of centering the student's experience, and I know a ton of schools are doing this in some pretty awesome ways, as we actually just heard, but how are you listening to and hearing from students beyond the academics? What has been their experience? And then what can you carry over into whatever your models, your scenarios, or your model is going into the next school year? But really thinking from the perspective of one of your more unique learners, what is this going to look like? If I have a student that has a one-to-one crisis paraprofessional that requires frequent movement breaks or the ability to go to a separate space for a brain break, what does that look like now with all the safety concerns? What about students that have sensitivities to materials or aren't going to be comfortable having things on their face? Are the decisions that you're making for your whole school taking those things into consideration? Assessing the level of accessibility and inclusion within whatever you're designing. Problem solving for complex needs, I said that one. Really thinking about the environment though. You know, how are you going to do flexible seating for students that need it? Is that even possible? And then determining things like related services. If we wait and schedule those last, I guarantee they're going to be separate add-on activities for students with disabilities and their families. Big takeaways, and then I'll just open it up, is that we have to recognize how many opportunities are actually on the table. I've never felt more like there's an ability to actually completely change how we define learning and how we design schools and what purpose they serve. Like this is our opportunity to actually change that. We've never had this opportunity to do that before. So really hoping that we don't just see this revert back to what existed pre-COVID, essentially. Like there's been such an expanded use of technology, and there's no reason that we should ever go back from that. I think obviously we all agree we could reel in some of the Zooming, but for some students, this has really elevated their level of access. Believe it or not, there is a huge increase in school-wide universal design for learning, and I'll just check out the guidelines at cas.org. But this is something that if I could get someone to drink some Kool-Aid, it would be around UDL and culturally sustaining pedagogies interwoven. And so many schools are doing UDL beyond what they actually thought that they could do, and seeing it as a school-wide tier 1 general education initiative as it should be. And so any way that we can keep that in place, you know, if you're planning for multiple scenarios, if you anchor your instructional framework in UDL, it will transfer across whatever situation arises. I promise you that. So much opportunity for increased inclusion and attention towards trauma-sensitive schooling. So this is a moment where, you know, I just keep thinking of the example of executive functioning skills. Like we are all learning new executive functioning skills as we're embracing this work from home situation. And so all of your students are going to have new skills or skills that need to be given more attention because of your brand new learning environment and your brand new model. So it's just a way to there's so many other examples, but things that used to be done in a silo. Thanks for the expanded definition of UDL, Mark. I'm throwing in all my acronyms here. But because things used to be done in a silo, skills taught in a silo, we're recognizing that actually all students can engage in these activities because all students are coming in with some very similar needs because of what we're experiencing right now. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, is that the degree of family partnership that is on the table right now. I mean, again, if we go back to just having family engagement be 3 parent-teacher conferences a year, like shame on us, right? Families have a direct lens now into how their child's IEP lives in your school. Like how instruction is designed to meet the needs of their child specifically. Like they have a direct lens into that. And so there's a lot of opportunity to co-construct what learning can look like, especially if we're tapping families to be supports or giving prompts or even co-teaching at times, right? Like we need to ask families what's working, what's not working, partner with them fully in the design of this new learning environment. And then the generalization of skills, I mean, typically what we see is that students with disabilities are going somewhere else to learn a very specific skill and then going back to all these environments. And right now they're actually learning these skills at home, which we hope means that again, they're able to work on them and develop them essentially out in the real world, which again, is just it takes away an extra step of them learning it in a silo and then applying it somewhere else. They're learning it and applying it in the same environment. I said a lot and not a lot of time. So
our last presentation is Debbie Lippert, going to talk about the role of the board in planning ahead.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you for letting me come and speak with you about the board's role in all of this work. I know that we had a lot of conversations around from school leaders and from students, how to bring equity into this work. And I want you to also be thinking about how do you bring your board along with you if they aren't there already. And if they are, I commend you for that. So Education Board Partners, we work with nonprofit boards, mostly charter schools across the country, and we really do talk about equity in everything that we do. So as you're thinking about moving forward with next steps, equity has to be a part of that, as you all know, and your board really needs to understand that. So today I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the board's role in equity and why it matters. This is the same type of picture that we saw from a couple of other presentations. And when it comes to equity, it really is ensuring that equally high outcomes for all. So how this plays out on your board is it could be in the recruitment and selecting of board members, reviewing academic, attendance, discipline data, hiring and supporting school leaders like yourselves, looking at salary and promotion policies, strategic decision-making, stakeholder engagement, all of the things that you as school leaders focus on, but making sure that your board really understands what your diversity, equity, inclusion policies are about, how this plays out throughout the school, and really how it cascades from the board throughout every aspect of your school. So at Education Board Partners, we developed these 6 standards that we encourage all boards to focus on. And if they are focusing on these things, they are focusing on the right things. And so I want to just kind of talk through what are the questions that you and your board should be asking around each of these things to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So when we're talking about academics at the board level, you know, the board could be asking, what are our plans for providing academic supports to the students that need it the most now and as we're planning for next phase reopening? What do we look at academic data disaggregated by subgroup? Are we able to see all subgroups so that we know that all students are achieving? And
is our board really asking questions about, are we closing the achievement gaps among our students? Not just achievement gaps between our students and other schools, but among our own students. So looking at disaggregated data really helps to provide that and have the board really understand about the data and what it means. When we think about school leader support and evaluation, that's for you. So do you have DEI goals and metrics as part of your annual goals? Is that part of your culture and your values? Have you discussed that staff and leaders are representative of the students you serve? So there's expectations from the board level all the way through the school. When we talk about governance, this is where the board really needs to focus on itself. So how is the board finding new board members? Are they looking outside their own networks so that they can find folks that have different experiences, different backgrounds, different demographics to bring those lens to bear on the decisions and the board work? Have they reflected on the diversity of their own board leadership? Is the board chair always a white male? What is the history? How does that happen? How does officer selection happen at the board level? Are all voices equal on the board? So when you're thinking about inclusion, does the board have an inclusive culture? Does everyone who is serving as a board member feel like their voice counts equally to others? And then is the board really asking itself, are they at risk at making decisions without fully understanding how these decisions may affect those they serve, the students, the teachers, the staff, the community? So really making sure that the board is focused on all of this. When the board is acting strategically, perhaps you have thought as a school leader that you should invest in a school-wide equity audit. Well, bring the board along with you. Explain how that is going to help serve who you are as an organization, who you are as a school, and help to create long-term connections to your staff, to your community, to your students, to you as a leader. Does your strategic plan gather input from diverse stakeholders, including school community? Or is it too insular that you're not looking outside for that? I think, as we've all seen, because now parents and communities are so invested in the students and the work that you're doing, it will be a lot easier to get information from them and make sure that you have a policy that you're including them. And then raising and using resources wisely. This is a big part of reopening. How are you going to make sure that you're allocating resources with equity, ensuring support goes to students who need it most? There's some students that have probably not been able to connect in with your distance learning. And how are you going to help bring those up to speed? What will you be doing to ensure that? For the board policies, does the board have a giving policy that allows all members from all incomes to participate, not just high net worth individuals, so that you do practice equity at the board level when you talk about membership? And I heard this from others earlier, do you have a policy prioritizing doing business with vendors that reflect your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Are you looking at your vendors? Are you looking at your vendors' policies? Are you looking at who your vendor serves? As we've seen throughout the times that we've seen since the murder of George Floyd, is there there are companies that have not been respectful in doing things, and they're losing business. So are you looking at those vendors with that same lens? And then compliance. I know that we just had a lot of conversations around special education, and I'm so grateful to Megan and her team. They've done lots of work with us around, and I've learned so much about special education and planning for opening schools, but just making sure that you're really following your compliance. And then, is the board looking at all of your policies? So safety, discipline, personnel, conduct, finances, with that equity lens, and making sure that any policy or practice that you put in place doesn't disproportionately impact or negatively or advantageously some over others. So really looking through the equity lens in everything that the board does. I just want you to reflect on this and hopefully have these questions with your board, with your community. Is ours a school where all families feel welcome? Are we actively working to see and understand the huge gaps in opportunities available to different students, as well as the gaps for outcomes? Are we actively working hard to close those gaps? Do we demonstrate in meaningful ways that we care about all students? Do we believe that Black Lives Matter? For next steps, I just want you to recognize that the board needs to give the school leader the support and backup to focus on equity. As school leaders, as board, let everyone know that this is what you are about. Make sure that when you are screening for new board members, you don't bring board members onto the board who don't get this. Equity can't be an afterthought. It must be intentional. I encourage you that it's a journey and you must move with urgency, but also give yourself grace in this work. We are doing a webinar series at Education Board Partners. I'll send out the information, but it's on June 24th is our kickoff webinar with John King, and it's Equity Focused Governance. I encourage you and your board members to join us for that. And if you have any need for any resources for your boards, for equity, for reopening, for thinking about all of these things, I encourage you to reach out to me. And here is all of my information, and my deck will be sent around as well, and so will the invitation to our equity webinar. But I just wanted to make sure that you bring your board along with you for all of this work, and I thank you for the time and attention.
Thanks, Debbie. That was great. Thank you all for coming. So I said this at the beginning, but if you like these webinars, please join us as a member for the 2021 school year. We're going to keep having them. Keep the conversation going. We'll send out an email with all of the resources from today, as well as a link to sign up. And then before we open it up for questions and discussion, Joe has a few things he wants to say really quickly.
Thanks. I'll make this 30 seconds. I want to encourage us to do modeling, not just talking about bringing people along, but listening to and learning from board members and community members who may know much more about what we're talking about than we do. Secondly, and lastly, you will be hearing very shortly about a national webinar collaboratively run by the coalition and other groups. It's going to talk about what we can do to have a positive outcome in state, local, and national elections. This will be a national webinar. Howard Fuller and others will be deeply involved, and you'll be hearing much more about it. It's likely to be a week from this Friday, and I would encourage people who sign up to include students and educators. Let's model what we talk about. Thanks.
Well, folks, thanks for coming, and we'll look for you guys at the November virtual summit, and good luck with all the opening of your schools.